Having a season with an OPS plus of 200 or higher is a remarkable feat. It essentially means that, for that season, that player was twice as good at getting on base and accumulating total bases than a league average player was. Many of baseball's greatest hitters, including Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, Tris Speaker, Ken Griffey Jr., Albert Pujols, Alex Rodriguez, and Mike Trout, have never done it. Throughout the history of the American League, National League, American Association, and National Association, only 31 players have had an OPS plus of 200 or more in a qualified season, meaning a season in which they had at least 3.1 plate appearances per team game played. Of those 31 players, only 11 have done it more than once. And if we look at the 8 players that have had 3 or more seasons with an OPS plus of 200 or higher, we essentially get a list of the greatest hitters in baseball history. Babe Ruth, Barry Bonds, Ted Williams, Rogers Hornsby, Mickey Mantle, Lou Gehrig, Ty Cobb, and Ross Barnes? Who the hell is Ross Barnes? The most memorable players from the early days of professional baseball are undoubtedly the pitchers. They pitched an absurd amount of innings, completed nearly every game they started, and put up some crazy single-season WAR totals as a result. A pitcher led the league in WAR every season during the 1870s, and the runner-up was a pitcher every season as well. There were a total of 35 5+ WAR seasons during the 1870s. Of those 35 seasons, 33 of them belonged to pitchers. The remaining 2 both belonged to Ross Barnes. For the first 6 years of Major League Baseball, which started with the National Association of Professional Baseball Players in 1871, Ross Barnes was undeniably the game's best hitter. During that 6-year span, he led the league in OPS 3 times, hit over 400 4 times, winning the batting title in 3 of those seasons, was the most valuable position player by WAR in 5 of the 6 seasons, and led the league in hits 4 times, runs scored 4 times, doubles 3 times, triples twice, total bases 4 times, on-base percentage 3 times, and slugging percentage 3 times. From 1871 to 1876, Barnes played in 331 of his team's 359 games. He recorded 669 hits, which was the most by any player during the span, 86 more than Cal McVeigh and George Wright, who each had 583. He scored 585 runs, which was also the most by any player during this period, over 100 more than second-place George Wright, and nearly 200 more than third-place Cal McVeigh. He drove in 294 runs, the third most during this period, and totaled 894 bases, the most by any player, and nearly 100 more than second-place George Wright. He had a 398, 424, 532 slash line, good for a 956 OPS and 194 OPS plus, and was worth 24.9 wins above replacement. All 6 of those numbers that I just mentioned were the highest of any player during this span by a significant margin. It's easy to understand how impressive those rate stats are, but I feel like the unusual sample of 331 games makes the magnitude of his counting stats a little harder to comprehend. So let's put them in terms that are more familiar. A modern baseball season consists of 162 games. So let's take Barnes' stats from 1871 to 1876 and find his averages per 162 games played. That way we can understand how Barnes' production compares to a modern baseball season. Before I reveal these numbers, I want to reiterate that we are not taking a small sample and extrapolating it to a longer period of time. This is not the same as when people say, oh, so-and-so hit 2 home runs in the first game of the season, so they're on pace for 324 home runs. We are taking a larger sample of 331 games over 6 seasons and applying it to a smaller time frame of 162 games. During his first 6 seasons, Ross Barnes averaged 327 hits, 286 runs scored, 144 runs batted in, 437 total bases, and 12.2 WAR per 162 games. The single-season record for hits is 262, and the single-season record for runs scored is 198. We can't know for sure how a longer season may have impacted Barnes' performance, but it seems very likely that had the National Association and National League seasons been longer than like 30 to 80 games in the 1870s, Barnes would have demolished both of these records before Ichiro Suzuki or Billy Hamilton even had a chance to set them. Barnes was also a terrific defensive infielder. While fielding percentage is a pretty useless defensive metric nowadays, it has a bit more merit when applied to the 1870s, before gloves were used, and when an average of around 7 errors were committed by each team per game. Barnes fielded the ball cleanly at a higher rate than any other second baseman of his era, as he led second baseman in fielding percentage in 1872, 1873, 1874, and 1876. The more advanced defensive metrics also support his strong defensive reputation. Baseball Reference gives him credit for 64 fielding runs, the defensive component of WAR, from 1871 to 1876. That's 31 fielding runs per 162 games played. By comparison, Ozzie Smith's fielding runs per 162 for his career is only 15. Brooks Robinson holds the MLB record for most career fielding runs, yet his fielding runs per 162 is only 16, about half of Barnes's. Even if you handpick Robinson's top 6 defensive seasons, you get 25 fielding runs per 162, still 6 fielding runs per 162 lower than Barnes's first 6 seasons. Now, the way that fielding runs are calculated does differ based on era, as the amount of information available to measure defensive ability decreases as we go deeper into the past. Additionally, it is easier to rack up fielding runs when everyone else around you is making errors left and right. I am by no means saying that Ross Barnes was a better defender than Brooks Robinson or Ozzie Smith, but on a rate basis, Baseball Reference WAR is saying that Ross Barnes was a better fielder compared to his contemporaries than Brooks Robinson was to his contemporaries, or Ozzie Smith to his. And Barnes's teams were very successful. The World Series didn't exist in Barnes's day, since there was only one major league. Instead, the league's champion, or pennant winner, was whichever team ended the season with the best record. Barnes won the National Association pennant with the Boston Red Stockings in 1872, 1873, 1874, and 1875. Barnes was the best hitter on these teams, but he was definitely not the sole reason for their success. These teams also featured star players Cal McVey, George Wright, Deacon White, Jim O'Rourke, and Al Spalding. From 1871 to 1876, Barnes, McVey, Wright, White, and O'Rourke ranked 1st, 4th, 5th, 7th, and 9th, respectively, in OPS+, and Al Spalding ranked 1st in ERA+, among pitchers with at least 1,000 innings pitched, while also being the 17th best hitter by OPS+. The Red Stockings reached their apex in 1875 when they finished with a 71-8-3 record, 18.5 games ahead of the second-placed Hartford Dark Blues, and 15 games ahead of the third-placed Philadelphia Athletics. Things get a little weird when teams don't all play the same number of games, I guess. The Red Stockings had a 149 team OPS plus that season, which is the highest mark by a team in MLB history. While the 1875 season was still in progress, though, it was announced that Barnes, White, McVey, and Spalding had all signed contracts with the Chicago White Stockings for the 1876 season. Boston fans, understandably, did not like that. In 1876, White, McVey, Spalding, and Barnes all jumped ship to the White Stockings, the National League replaced the National Association, and Ross Barnes had the best season of his career. He led the league in every stat imaginable and set multiple records. His 1.91 runs scored per game still has not been surpassed in either the National League or the American League, and the 54 runs scored separating Barnes and second-place George Wright is still the largest gap in that stat in AL/NL history, despite players now having more than twice as many games in a season to distance themselves from the competition. Barnes also hit the National League's first home run, and the Chicago White Stockings won the very first National League pennant, with their 146 team OPS plus being the second highest in MLB history, behind the aforementioned 1875 Red Stockings. Their top 5 players in WAR that season were all new additions: Spalding, Barnes, White, and McVey from the Red Stockings, and Cap Anson from the Philadelphia Athletics. For Barnes, it was the 5th straight pennant he had won. It would also be his last, as things would go south for the White Stockings and their star player in 1877. Before we can talk about that, though, first we need to discuss why Ross Barnes was such a successful hitter. Barnes was not a slugger. With home runs being so rare, hitting the ball as hard as possible was not as effective of a strategy then as it is now. Instead, Ross Barnes was a finesse hitter. In his day, he was referred to as a scientific hitter. He had an uncanny ability to hit the ball exactly where he wanted, a skill that was especially useful in the early days of baseball when the rules were a bit different from how they are now. In today's game, if a batted ball goes into foul territory before passing third or first base, it's a foul ball, regardless of whether or not it started in fair territory. In the National Association, and the first season of the National League, however, whether a ball was fair or foul was entirely dependent on where it first hit the ground. If a ball hit the ground in fair territory, it was a fair ball, even if it entered foul territory shortly after. Many batters took advantage of this, and intentionally tried to hit balls that would start in fair territory but then go foul, out of reach of the opposing fielders. In a demonstration of creative naming, this technique was called a fair foul. For most players, the typical approach to fair foul hitting was either to lay down a bunt in such a way as to put spin on the ball, causing it to roll into foul territory, or to chop down at the pitch as it approached home plate, hoping to accomplish the same thing. This approach, if done successfully, would most often result in a single. But Ross Barnes was not like most players. Barnes took full swings, and was able to achieve fair foul doubles and triples when the ball went out of the reach of the defending third baseman. Sometimes defending teams would use a shift against Barnes, and move the third baseman closer to the third base line to give him a better chance of fielding an attempted fair foul. In these cases, Barnes would simply adjust his hitting approach and send a line drive into the gap that the shift created between the third baseman and the shortstop. While this may seem like a cheap way to play baseball when viewing it from a modern lens, it was not thought of that way at the time. Fair foul hits were not easy to pull off, and very few players were able to regularly get fair foul hits with full swings the way that Barnes was. The league's best fair foul hitters were widely praised for their skill and technical ability with the bat. And as much as I want to run with the narrative that the rules were changed as a way to nerf Barnes, that isn't exactly true. In 1877, the National League did adopt a new rule regarding fair and foul balls, and it's actually the same rule that exists in Major League Baseball today. If a batted ball enters foul territory before going past the third or first base bag, it is a foul ball, even if it initially landed in fair territory. According to an article by Robert H. Schaefer that was published in the National Pastime, though, the reason for this rule change was not because the fair foul was considered unfair, but rather to make it easier for umpires to determine if a batted ball was fair or foul. According to Schaefer, quote, "The main objection to fair foul hitting lay in the umpire's limited ability to make the correct call of fair or foul. None of the opponents of fair foul hitting thought it provided a hitter with a second-rate means of attaining first base, or that it was a cheap hit. Quite the opposite was true. It was universally regarded as requiring exceptional finesse. Only the most highly skilled strikers were able to execute it with consistency. The principal objection to it was that the umpire's decision usually precipitated disputes that degraded the quality of the game. Fair foul hitting simply caused nasty arguments." Apparently, complaining about umpiring has been around since as long as professional baseball itself. I wonder if they had an Angel Hernandez back then. Regardless of the reasoning behind it, the rules were changed in 1877, eliminating the fair foul, and Ross Barnes' 1877 stats look like this. His .235 OPS plus from 1876 plummeted to an 84 OPS plus in 1877. His .429 batting average dropped to a .272 batting average, and his 5.7 WAR in 1876, the highest ever in a season by a position player up until that point in time, was followed up by a 0.1 WAR in 1877. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this is the biggest and most abrupt fall-off in MLB history. The lack of production from Barnes certainly hurt the White Stockings. They followed up their pennant-winning performance in 1876 with a 26-33-1 record in 1877, finishing 5th out of 6 teams. Their team OPS plus was 91, 49 points lower than the previous season. And while Barnes' 151-point decrease played a major part in this, he is not solely responsible for his team's woes. Al Spalding was arguably more responsible for the team's disappointing season, as he gave up pitching in 1877, opting to play first base instead. Not only did he have a career-low 79 OPS plus as a first baseman in 1877, but George Bradley, the pitcher that was brought in to replace him, managed only a 3.31 ERA and 90 ERA plus, a massive regression from his 1.23 ERA and 170 ERA plus with St. Louis the previous season, and a significant downgrade from Spalding's 1.75 ERA and 137 ERA plus as the White Stockings' primary pitcher the season prior. Cap Anson and Paul Hines also had down years. Their OPS pluses were 31 and 49 points lower than their 1876 marks respectively. Additionally, Deacon White left the team and returned to Boston. The team added Dave Egler from Philadelphia, but he did not meet expectations. Egler was a prominent fair foul hitter, and he was unable to adapt to the rule change. He had a 108 OPS plus with the Athletics in 1876, but managed only a 68 OPS plus with the White Stockings in 1877. Following his disappointing 1877 season, Barnes was unable to find a job in the National League in 1878, so he instead joined the London Tecumsehs of the International Association as a player-manager. That's London, Ontario, by the way, not London, England. The International Association only lasted for 2 seasons and was not a major league. Although some consider it to be the first minor league, it is not officially recognized as such. Regardless of how you classify it, either minor or independent, it was certainly a major step down from the National League for Ross Barnes. Unfortunately, there are no statistics available for Barnes' 1878 International Association season. Barnes also filed a lawsuit against the White Stockings in 1878 as they had failed to pay him 3 months of his salary during the 1877 season. Sound familiar? Unfortunately, the judge ruled against Barnes, and he never received the money that he was owed. Instead of pursuing legal recourse, he probably should have just taken money from gamblers to throw games instead. Barnes did return to the National League in 1879 as a shortstop for the Cincinnati Reds. He was a serviceable player for them, but was nowhere near the same player as he was just a few years prior. They did not re-sign him for the 1880 season, and he was once again unable to find a team to play for. He didn't have the International Association to turn to this time though, as it had folded following the 1878 season, so he was forced to sit out and watch from the sidelines. He was given one last chance in 1881 as he returned to Boston to play shortstop. He put together another decent but unremarkable season, then never played professional baseball again. Barnes' downfall was perplexing though. Yes, the rule change had taken away a valuable tool from his repertoire, but Barnes was far from a one-trick pony from 1871 to 1876. He was a master of the fair foul and used it when beneficial for him and his team, but he also had a reputation as a complete hitter who could hit to all fields. In fact, according to Schaefer, everyone assumed that Barnes would remain the National League's best hitter in 1877 despite the elimination of the fair foul. In addition to being completely unproductive when he played, Barnes also missed 38 of his team's 60 games in 1877 with an illness that lasted for months. The illness was referred to as the ague, and its symptoms included fever, chills, and loss of strength. According to Schaefer and other sources, the illness had a permanent effect on Barnes, and this, rather than the rule change, is the reason for his sudden poor play after being so dominant for 6 seasons. This explanation would help to explain why he sharply declined not only offensively after 1876, but also defensively. His fielding run totals were negative in each of his final 3 seasons, and he led the league in errors committed by a shortstop in 1881. The elimination of the fair foul definitely could not have caused that. In all likelihood, both the illness and the rule change probably played some part in Barnes' fall from grace. Looking at other prominent fair foul hitters, as listed by Schaefer, George Wright's OPS plus dropped from a 136 in 1876 to a 96 in 1877, and as we've already discussed, Dave Egler's dropped from a 108 to a 68. Levi Mayerl, on the other hand, only had a 12-point decrease from 162 in 1876 to 150 in 1877, and Davey Force's OPS plus actually increased from 1876 to 1877. Unfortunately, in Barnes' case, it's impossible to know how much of an effect the rule change had on him. 2 variables changed at the same time, and there's no way to determine how much of an impact each one of those variables had. What we can be certain about, though, is that for the first 6 years of Major League Baseball, Ross Barnes was a better hitter than anyone else by a significant margin. He identified an effective hitting strategy, mastered it, implemented it when beneficial, and punished opponents for opening up their defensive formation when they shifted to try to prevent it. Even after you factor in his mediocre 1877, 1879, and 1881 seasons, Barnes' career stats are still incredible. Among non-active players with a minimum of 2,500 plate appearances in the AL, NL, AA, and/or NA, Ross Barnes ranks 10th all-time in OPS+, 2nd all-time in batting average, and tied for 2nd all-time in WAR per 162. Among second basemen, Barnes ranks 2nd all-time in OPS+, 1st all-time in batting average, and is tied for 1st all-time in WAR per 162 with Rogers Hornsby. Barnes set multiple records that still stand to this day, hit the National League's first home run, and won 5 straight pennants. He put up offensive numbers that put him in the same conversation as Ty Cobb and Mickey Mantle, and defensive numbers that put him in the same conversation as Brooks Robinson and Ozzie Smith. His career was short, but his list of accomplishments is anything but.